Mom, we sold the house and Olivia already spent most of the $620,000, my son said casually, setting his car keys on my kitchen counter. So we'll be staying here with you for a while. I didn't answer right away. I just stood there, my hand still resting on the edge of the sink, feeling the cool porcelain under my fingers as if it could anchor me to something real. Sold the house. The words didn't make sense at first, like hearing a sentence in a language you almost understand, but not quite. I turned slowly to look at Daniel, searching his face for any sign that this was some kind of mistake, a misunderstanding I could gently correct, the way I used to when he was a boy and got his homework wrong. But there was no confusion in his eyes, only certainty, and something else I didn't recognize. Behind him, Olivia stepped into my home as if she already belonged there, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor I had polished myself just 2 days ago. She didn't ask where to put her coat. She didn't wait to be invited further in. She simply walked past me, glancing around the room with a small, satisfied smile, like someone inspecting a property they had just purchased. It makes more sense this way, she said lightly, running her fingers along the back of one of my dining chairs. We didn't want to waste money on temporary housing. Temporary. I repeated the word in my mind, turning it over slowly, trying to understand how my life had suddenly become something temporary to them. What house? I finally asked, my voice quieter than I expected, almost steady. Daniel frowned slightly, as if I had missed something obvious. The house, Mom. The one Dad left. We talked about this. No, we didn't. I would have remembered. I would have remembered signing something, agreeing to something, even just hearing about something like that. That house wasn't just a property. It was where I had spent 37 years of my life, where every wall held a memory, where every window had once framed a version of our family that I thought still existed somewhere. And the money? I asked, my fingers tightening just slightly against the sink. What money? Olivia let out a small laugh, not unkind, but not kind either, just dismissive. The proceeds, Margaret. $620,000. Daniel had it transferred a few months ago. A few months ago. I blinked, trying to place myself back in that time, searching for anything that felt different, anything that could have hinted at this. But all I could remember were quiet mornings, careful grocery lists, and the steady rhythm of a life I thought I still understood. Transferred to where? I asked. This time, Daniel hesitated. Just for a second. But it was enough. Olivia answered instead. To me, she said simply, meeting my eyes without hesitation. It was easier that way for investment purposes. Investment. The words settled into the room like dust, soft but suffocating. I looked at my son again, really looked at him this time, searching for the boy who used to sit at this very table with his elbows propped up, asking me if we could have pancakes for dinner. But that boy wasn't there anymore. In his place stood a man who had made decisions about my life without ever thinking to include me in them. And you thought? I paused, choosing my words carefully. That I wouldn't need to know about any of this? Daniel shifted his weight, glancing briefly at Olivia before answering. We didn't want to stress you out, Mom. It's complicated, and we handled it. We handled it. I nodded slowly, letting the words settle where they needed to. Olivia had already moved into the living room now, setting her handbag down on my coffee table, right on top of the lace runner I had kept pristine for years. She adjusted it slightly, not noticing, or not caring, that it wasn't centered anymore. You'll like having us here, she added, her tone light, almost cheerful. It'll be good for you not to be alone. Not alone. I almost smiled at that. Because in that moment, standing in my own kitchen, listening to strangers rearrange the pieces of my life, I had never felt more alone in my 72 years. But I didn't say any of that. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply turned off the faucet I hadn't realized was still running, dried my hands carefully on a dish towel, and folded it the way I always did, precise and even. Then I looked at them both, memorizing the ease with which they had stepped into my home, into my life, as if everything here already belonged to them. And for the first time, a quiet thought settled into my mind, calm and clear. They believed this was their beginning. They had no idea it was mine. I woke up the next morning earlier than usual, before the sun had fully risen, the house still quiet in that fragile way it used to be before everything changed, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to pretend nothing had happened, that Daniel was still a boy asleep down the hall, and that Olivia had never stepped foot into this home, But then I walked into the kitchen and saw her coffee mug already sitting in the sink. A lipstick mark pressed firmly against the rim, and I knew that whatever had shifted the night before had not been a passing moment. It had settled in. I moved slowly, deliberately, as I always did, reaching for my kettle, filling it halfway with water, setting it on the stove. Each motion familiar, grounding, something that still belonged to me. I did not rush. I did not make noise. I listened. Upstairs, I could hear footsteps, not Daniel's heavy, careless stride, but Olivia's lighter, more controlled pace, as if even the way she walked was calculated. A drawer opened, then closed, then another. She was exploring, learning the layout, mapping it in her mind. I stood there with my hand resting on the counter, staring at the small crack in the tile that my husband had promised to fix 10 years ago, a crack I had chosen to leave exactly as it was because it reminded me of a promise made, not broken. "You're up early." Olivia's voice came from behind me, smooth, composed, as if we were two women sharing a perfectly ordinary morning. I turned slightly, offering a polite nod. "I always am." She smiled, stepping further into the kitchen, already dressed, already put together, her hair neat, her posture straight, like someone preparing for a day that belonged entirely to her. She opened my refrigerator without asking, scanning the shelves with quiet judgment before pulling out a container of fresh fruit I had cut the night before. "We should probably reorganize this," she said casually, closing the door with her hip. "It is a little inefficient." Inefficient. I let the words settle the same way I had let all the others settle, without reacting, without correcting her. "If you would like to make breakfast, you can," I said instead, my voice calm. "Even. I have everything you need." She paused for just a second, as if she had expected resistance, then smiled again, softer this time, but no warmer. "That is kind of you." Kind. I turned back to the stove as the kettle began to hum, the sound low and steady, building towards something louder, something impossible to ignore. Behind me, I could hear her moving things, shifting plates, opening drawers, making small adjustments that seemed insignificant on their own, but together felt like the slow rewriting of a space I had spent decades creating. Daniel came down a few minutes later, his shirt wrinkled, his expression distracted, already scrolling through his phone as he entered the room. He did not look at me right away. He did not notice what had changed. Or maybe he chose not to. "Morning, Mom," he said absently, pressing a quick kiss to the side of my head before moving past me toward the coffee machine. I nodded, watching him out of the corner of my eye. There was no hesitation in him, no awareness, just routine. Familiar, comfortable routine, as if nothing about this arrangement was unusual. As if he had always lived here this way. As if I were the one visiting. I poured my tea slowly, the steam rising in soft curls, and took my usual seat at the table, folding my hands in front of me, listening to them talk about plans I had not been included in, about purchases already made, about decisions already finalized. I did not interrupt. I did not ask questions. I simply sat there, absorbing every word, every tone, every glance between them. And somewhere beneath the quiet surface I had perfected over the years, something steady began to take shape, something patient, something precise. Because for the first time, I was no longer trying to understand what they had done. I was beginning to understand what I would do next. I began to notice the small things first, the kind of details most people would overlook, but I had lived in this house long enough to understand that nothing ever changed without leaving a trace. Not really. The second morning, the sugar jar was no longer beside the stove where I had kept it for years. It had been moved closer to the coffee machine, placed neatly beside Olivia's imported espresso pods as if it had always belonged there. The third morning, the set of blue plates I reserved for Sundays was gone from the upper cabinet, replaced by a stack of minimalist white dishes that did not match anything else in the kitchen. I did not ask where my plates had gone. I already knew the answer would not matter. Instead, I adjusted. I reached for what was left, moving through my own home as if I were learning it for the first time, careful not to disturb the order that was slowly being rewritten around me. Daniel had settled into a rhythm that did not include me. He left early, often before I had finished my tea, his attention fixed on his phone, his conversations short and efficient, as if every word had been measured for productivity. "We are looking at a new investment property," he mentioned one morning, not to me, but to Olivia, his voice carrying just enough for me to hear. If everything lines up, we can move forward next quarter. Olivia nodded, already scrolling through something on her tablet, her expression focused, satisfied. We should. The market is right. The market is right. I let the phrase pass through me without reaction, even as I felt the quiet irony settle in my chest. There had been a time when Daniel would have asked for my opinion, when he would have sat at this same table and explained every detail, eager for approval, eager for guidance. That time was gone. In its place was something colder, something more efficient, something that did not require me at all. Later that afternoon, I walked into the living room and paused just inside the doorway. Olivia had rearranged the furniture. The armchair where my husband used to sit was now angled toward the window instead of the television, as if its purpose had changed. The small table beside it, the one that had held his books, his reading glasses, the quiet evidence of his presence, had been replaced with a decorative piece I did not recognize. Clean, modern, empty. I stood there for a long moment, taking it in, allowing myself to feel the absence without letting it show. It opens up the space, Olivia said from behind me, her tone conversational, as if we were discussing something neutral, something harmless. It feels less cluttered. Cluttered. I nodded slowly, keeping my voice steady. It does. And in that moment, I understood something with complete clarity. This was not just about convenience or comfort. This was about erasure. Not loud, not obvious, but deliberate. Piece by piece, they were removing the life I had built and replacing it with something that suited them better. Something that did not require history. Something that did not require me. I turned away from the room without another word, walking down the hallway at my usual pace, my steps measured, my posture straight, my expression calm. But inside, something had shifted again, not with shock this time, but with certainty. They were not just living in my house. They were rewriting it. And I was done pretending not to see it. That evening, I sat alone in my bedroom with the door slightly closed, not locked, never locked, because I had learned that privacy in my own home had quietly become a privilege rather than a right, and I did not want to draw attention to something they might decide I no longer needed. The lamp beside my bed cast a soft yellow light across the dresser, illuminating the small wooden box where I kept the few things I still considered entirely mine. I opened it slowly, carefully, as if the act itself required intention, and inside were the same items that had been there for years: my husband's watch, a faded photograph from our first home, and a thin folder of documents I had not touched in a long time. I rested my hand on top of that folder, not opening it yet, just feeling its presence, grounding myself in something that had not been moved, not been adjusted, not been redefined by someone else's convenience. Down the hall, I could hear Olivia's voice, low and controlled, speaking to Daniel in the way she always did when she wanted something to sound reasonable, logical, inevitable. "We should think about renovating the upstairs bathroom," she said. "It is outdated, and if we are going to stay here, it needs to reflect that." Reflect that. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the words settle. If we are going to stay here. There was no question in her voice. No uncertainty. Only assumption. Daniel responded. After a brief pause, his tone thoughtful but not resistant. "We can look into it. Maybe next month." Next month. Plans were being made now, timelines discussed, changes scheduled, all without a single conversation with me. I opened my eyes and finally lifted the folder from the box, placing it gently on my lap. The paper felt familiar under my fingers, slightly worn at the edges, as if it had been waiting patiently for this moment. I did not rush as I opened it. I never rushed anymore. Inside were copies of documents I had kept for reasons I could not fully explain at the time, small decisions made years ago that now seemed less like habit and more like instinct. Ownership records, signatures, dates, details that told a story far more precise than the one Daniel and Olivia believed they were living. I read each page slowly, carefully, not searching for anything new, but confirming what I already suspected. There were gaps, small ones, technical ones, but real. The kind of details that could be overlooked by someone eager to move quickly, someone confident they understood the full picture. I closed the folder again and placed it back into the box, not hiding it, not protecting it, simply returning it to where it belonged. Then I sat there for a while longer, listening to the quiet sounds of movement in the house, drawers opening, footsteps crossing the floor, the soft rhythm of a life continuing around me, as if I were no longer at its center. And for the first time since they arrived, I allowed myself a small, almost invisible smile, not because I was happy, but because I understood something they did not. They believed everything had already been decided. They believed the past had been settled, signed away, transferred, completed. But they had moved too quickly, assumed too much, overlooked just enough. And now, for the first time, I was no longer reacting to what they had done. I was beginning to see exactly where they had made their mistake. The next morning, I did something I had not done in a very long time. I left the house without telling anyone where I was going. I moved quietly, the same way I had been moving for days now, careful not to disturb the new rhythm they had created, careful not to invite questions I was not ready to answer. Olivia was already in the kitchen when I passed by, standing in front of the open pantry, rearranging shelves with the same focused precision she brought to everything else. She glanced at me briefly, her eyes flicking over my coat, my purse, my shoes, taking inventory without asking. "Running errands?" she asked, her tone polite, neutral, as if she were asking out of courtesy rather than curiosity. I nodded once. Yes. She did not press further. She never did when she believed the answer did not matter. Outside, the air was cool, the kind of crisp morning that made everything feel sharper, more defined. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine, my hands resting on the steering wheel, steady, deliberate. There was a time when I would have hesitated, when I would have questioned whether I was overreacting, whether I should give them the benefit of the doubt, whether I should wait for an explanation that might make all of this feel less intentional. That time had passed. The drive to the bank took 15 minutes. The same route I had taken countless times before, though it felt different now. Not unfamiliar, just clearer. When I walked inside, the familiar scent of polished floors and quiet order greeted me. And for the first time in days, I felt something settle into place. This was a space that still operated on rules, on records, on facts that could not be rearranged by preference or convenience. "Mrs. Hayes," the manager greeted me with a warm, professional smile as I approached the desk. "It has been a while." I returned the smile, measured and calm. "It has." We sat down, and I placed my purse carefully on the chair beside me, taking out the folder I had reviewed the night before. I did not rush. I never rushed. I would like to review all recent transactions related to my accounts and any associated transfers, I said, my voice even, controlled. The manager nodded, turning to his computer, his expression attentive, respectful. Minutes passed in quiet efficiency, the soft clicking of keys, the low hum of the building around us. Then, gradually, his expression shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way most people would notice, but I noticed. A slight pause, a narrowing of the eyes. "There are some transfers here," he said carefully, turning the screen slightly so I could see. Substantial ones. I leaned forward just enough to read the numbers, the dates, the destinations. Everything was there. Every movement. Every decision that had been made without me. I did not react. I did not need to. "And the authorization?" I asked. "Who approved these?" He hesitated, just briefly, then pointed to a line on the screen. A signature. My name. I looked at it for a long moment, studying the shape of the letters, the curve of the pen strokes, the familiarity of something that was almost, but not quite mine. "I see," I said quietly, sitting back in my chair. The manager cleared his throat slightly. "If there is any concern regarding these transactions, we can initiate a formal review." I nodded once, slowly. "Yes," I said. "I believe that would be appropriate." There was no anger in my voice. No urgency. Just certainty. Because as I sat there, looking at that signature, at the precise place where everything had shifted, I understood something even more clearly than before. This was not just a mistake. This was not just oversight. This was deliberate, calculated, and most importantly, it was traceable. I closed the folder gently, placing it back into my purse with the same care I had used that morning, and rose from my seat without hesitation. "Please begin the process," I added, meeting the manager's eyes with a calm that felt almost unfamiliar now, not because it was new, but because it had changed. It was no longer the calm of someone enduring. It was the calm of someone who had already decided what came next. When I returned home that afternoon, nothing looked different at first glance, and that was what made it so revealing. The same polished floors, the same carefully arranged furniture, The same quiet order that now felt less like comfort and more like control, as if everything had been adjusted just enough to erase me without drawing attention to the absence. Olivia was in the living room again, seated on the sofa with her laptop open, her posture relaxed but alert, the way someone sits when they believe they are in charge of the space around them. She glanced up as I entered, offering a small, measured smile. "You were out longer than I expected," she said, her tone light but observant, as if she had been tracking time without making it obvious. I set my purse down on the side table, exactly where I had always placed it, even though I knew she had moved it twice already this week. "I had a few things to take care of," I replied calmly. She studied me for a second longer than necessary, her eyes searching for something she could not quite define, then nodded and returned her attention to the screen. Daniel came in shortly after, his presence filling the room in that familiar way, but there was a distance now, a subtle shift in how he carried himself, as if he no longer saw me as part of the foundation of this home, but as something adjacent to it. "Hey, Mom," he said, distracted, loosening his tie as he walked past me. "We might have someone come by this weekend to look at the upstairs, just to get an estimate." I turned slightly, meeting his gaze with quiet focus. "An estimate for what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Renovations," Olivia replied before he could, closing her laptop with a soft click and standing up. "If we are going to stay here long term, we should make some improvements. It is an investment." Investment. The word again. I nodded once, absorbing it without resistance. "Of course," I said, my voice steady, almost agreeable. Daniel seemed relieved by that, his shoulders easing slightly as if he had expected an argument that never came. "It will increase the value," he added, more to himself than to me. "And it makes sense given everything." Given everything. I watched them both for a moment, noting the ease with which they spoke about changes that did not belong to them, decisions that had been made without consequence in their minds, assumptions that had never been challenged. Then I turned away, walking slowly toward the kitchen, my steps measured, my expression unchanged. I reached for a glass, filled it with water, and took a small sip, letting the silence settle around me again. Behind me, their conversation resumed, casual, confident, uninterrupted. They were already living in the outcome they believed was permanent. But as I stood there, the events of the morning returning to me with quiet clarity, the screen at the bank, the signature that was not quite mine, the confirmation that everything they had built there. Certain Tion was flawed, I felt something shift into place completely. Not anger, not even betrayal anymore. Just clarity. I set the glass down gently, aligning it with the edge of the counter the way I always did, precise, intentional. Then, without turning around, I spoke, my voice calm, even, almost soft. "Daniel," I said. He paused mid-sentence, surprised by the interruption. "Yes." I did not look at him. "Next time you make a decision involving my name," I continued, my tone unchanged, "you should make sure it is actually mine." The room went quiet. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for the words to settle exactly where they needed to. I picked up my glass again, taking another sip, as if nothing had shifted at all. But I knew it had. And this time, so did they. Daniel did not respond immediately, and that silence told me more than any explanation could have, because it was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of someone realizing that something they believed was settled had just shifted beneath them. Olivia was the first to move. Of course she was, her composure returning almost instantly as she stepped forward, her expression calm but sharpened, like someone adjusting to a change in negotiation. "I am sure there is some misunderstanding," she said smoothly, her voice controlled, measured, as if she could still guide the direction of the moment. I turned then, finally looking at her directly, not with anger, not with accusation, but with something steadier, something far more difficult to dismiss. "No," I said quietly. "There is not." Daniel let out a short breath, running a hand through his hair, a gesture I had seen since he was a teenager, back when it meant frustration over something small, something temporary. Now it meant something else. "Mom, if this is about paperwork or timing, we can sort it out," he said, his tone attempting reassurance, but lacking certainty. I watched him for a moment, noting the way he avoided meeting my eyes fully, the way his words leaned toward convenience rather than truth. "It is already being sorted," I replied. That was when Olivia's expression changed, Not dramatically, not in a way most people would notice, but I noticed. A slight tightening around her eyes. A pause in her breathing. Just enough to confirm what I needed to know. She understood. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice still calm, but no longer as effortless as before. I picked up my glass again, holding it lightly, not drinking, just giving myself a moment to choose my words. "It means," I said, "that the bank is reviewing every transaction connected to my name." The room stilled again, but this time the silence felt different, heavier, more precise. Daniel looked at me fully now, his earlier distraction gone, replaced by something closer to concern. "You did not have to do that," he said quickly. "We could have handled this as a family." As a family? I almost smiled, but I did not. "You already handled it," I said. "Without me." Olivia stepped closer then, her posture still composed, but her movements more deliberate, as if she were recalibrating, searching for control that was no longer as easily within reach. "There is no need to escalate this," she said, her tone softer now, persuasive. "Everything was done with the intention of improving your situation. We were thinking long term." Long term. I held her gaze, letting the words settle between us. "Then you should not be concerned," I replied simply. For the first time since she had walked into my home, Olivia did not have an immediate answer. Daniel shifted beside her, the confidence that had carried him through the past few days beginning to fracture in small, subtle ways. I could see it in the way he stood, in the way his shoulders no longer rested as easily, in the way his eyes moved between us as if trying to find stable ground. I set my glass down once more, aligning it carefully, the same quiet precision I had always maintained, and turned away from them again, not dismissing them, not avoiding them, simply choosing not to continue a conversation that had already revealed everything it needed to. Behind me, I could feel the shift, the realization settling in, slow but undeniable. They had believed they were in control. They had believed the decisions were final. But now, for the first time, they were beginning to understand that the story they thought they had written was not finished, and more importantly, it was no longer theirs to control. That night, the house felt different again, not because anything had been moved or rearranged, but because something invisible had shifted, something that could not be undone with polite conversation or careful positioning. I sat at the dining table longer than usual, my hands resting lightly against the wood, feeling the familiar surface beneath my fingertips, grounding myself in something that had not changed, not yet. Upstairs, I could hear the low murmur of their voices behind a closed door, quieter than before, more cautious, as if they understood now that not everything in this house belonged to them, not even the silence. I did not try to listen. I did not need to. Whatever they were saying, whatever plans they were adjusting, I already knew the foundation of it had begun to crack. The next morning, I woke to the sound of movement earlier than usual, not the steady rhythm I had grown accustomed to over the past few days, but something more restless, more deliberate. When I stepped into the hallway, Daniel was already dressed, his tie slightly uneven, his expression tighter than before. He paused when he saw me, just for a moment, then forced a small, controlled smile. "Morning," he said, his voice careful. Careful. That was new. "Good morning," I replied, matching his tone, calm, even, unchanged. Olivia appeared shortly after, her posture still composed, but the ease she had carried when she first arrived was no longer there, replaced by something more measured, more watchful. She did not move through the house as freely now. She observed, calculated, adjusted. "We might need to review some documents later," she said, directing her words toward Daniel, but her eyes flicking briefly toward me. "Just to make sure everything is aligned." Aligned. I nodded slightly, not acknowledging the implication, not correcting it, simply allowing the word to exist between us. "That sounds reasonable," I said. Daniel looked at me again, longer this time, as if trying to read something in my expression, something that would tell him how far this had gone, how much I knew, how much control he had already lost. But I gave him nothing. No anger, no accusation, just the same quiet presence he had learned to overlook. And that, I realized, was what unsettled him most. I moved into the kitchen, preparing my tea the same way I always did, each motion steady, deliberate, unchanged. Behind me, their conversation continued, but the confidence was gone now, replaced by brief pauses, by lowered voices, by the subtle tension of people who had begun to question their own certainty. They were no longer discussing plans. They were assessing risk. I poured my tea slowly, watching the steam rise in soft, curling lines, and for the first time since all of this began, I allowed myself to fully understand the position we were now in. They believed they had taken control of my life. They believed they had rewritten the structure of this home, that they had secured their place within it. But what they had actually done was expose every step they had taken, every decision made without me, every assumption built on something that was never truly theirs to claim. I took my seat at the table, folding my hands in front of me, listening as their voices softened further, as uncertainty settled into the spaces where confidence had once been. And in that quiet, measured moment, I knew something with complete clarity. This was no longer about what they had done. It was about what they were about to lose. 2 days later, the call came in the middle of the afternoon, at a time when the house was unusually still, as if even the walls were waiting for something to happen. I was in the living room, seated in the armchair Olivia had repositioned, the one that now faced the window instead of the television, and for a moment I considered not answering, not out of fear, but out of control, because I already knew what the call would bring. But I let it ring twice more before picking up. "Mrs. Hayes," the voice on the other end said, calm and professional, the same bank manager I had spoken with before. "I wanted to inform you that we have completed the preliminary review." I did not respond immediately. I simply listened. "There are multiple irregularities in the authorization process," he continued, his tone precise, careful. "The signature used does not fully match your verified records, and the transfer approvals did not follow standard verification protocols." I closed my eyes briefly, not in surprise, but in acknowledgement. "I understand," I said quietly. "We are proceeding with a formal investigation," he added. "In the meantime, the remaining funds connected to those accounts have been temporarily restricted." Restricted. The words settled into place exactly as it needed to. "Thank you," I replied, my voice steady, then ended the call without further discussion. For a moment, I sat there in silence, the phone still in my hand, the house unchanged around me, and yet everything within it had shifted again, this time in a way that could not be ignored, not by them, not anymore. I set the phone down gently on the table beside me and rose from the chair, smoothing my hands over the fabric of my skirt as I moved toward the kitchen. Olivia was there, of course, standing near the counter, her laptop open, her expression focused, but there was something different now, something tighter beneath the surface. Daniel stood across from her, his posture rigid, his voice low but urgent. "What do you mean it is restricted?" he was saying, his words sharp with disbelief. Olivia shook her head slightly, her composure strained but intact. "There must be a delay. These things happen." Delay. I stepped into the room then, my presence quiet but undeniable, and both of them turned toward me at the same time. Daniel's expression shifted first, confusion giving way to realization, then something closer to concern. "Mom," he said, his voice uncertain now. "Did you?" He did not finish the question. He did not need to. I met his gaze calmly, not raising my voice, not changing my tone. "Yes," I said. That was all. Just one word. Olivia straightened slightly, her eyes narrowing in a way she could not fully hide now, her control slipping just enough to reveal the tension beneath it. "You froze the accounts?" she asked, her voice controlled, but no longer effortless. I tilted my head slightly, considering the phrasing. "No," I replied evenly. "The bank did." Daniel took a step back, running his hand through his hair again. But this time the gesture did not carry frustration. It carried something heavier, something closer to fear. "This is going to complicate things," he said, more to himself than to me. Complicate. I let the word settle between us, the same way I had let all the others settle. "It already was," I said quietly. The room fell silent again, but this silence was no longer uncertain. It was clear, defined, final in a way neither of them had anticipated. Olivia closed her laptop slowly, her movements controlled, deliberate, as if she were trying to regain a sense of order that had already begun to slip away. Daniel looked at me again, really looked this time, as if seeing me for the first time in days, perhaps for the first time in years. And I simply stood there, calm, composed, unchanged, because while they were only just beginning to understand what was happening, I had already moved one step further ahead, and I was no longer waiting for them to catch up. The rest of that day unfolded in a way that felt unfamiliar, not because anything dramatic happened, but because everything they did now carried weight, every movement measured, every word carefully chosen, as if they were walking across something fragile they could not yet see. Daniel stayed home longer than usual, pacing between the living room and the kitchen, his phone in hand, his voice low and controlled as he made calls that grew shorter with each attempt. "No, that does not make sense," he said at one point, his frustration slipping through despite his effort to contain it. "There must be some kind of error." Error. I remained seated at the dining table, my hands folded in front of me, listening without appearing to listen, allowing the rhythm of his words to pass through the room without interruption. Olivia, on the other hand, did not pace. She stood still, almost completely still, her laptop open but untouched, her eyes fixed on the screen as if waiting for something to change on its own. But it did not. "We need access to those funds," Daniel said sharply, his voice rising just enough to break the careful balance he had been trying to maintain. "We have commitments." Commitments. Olivia finally moved then, closing her laptop slowly and turning toward him, her expression composed but strained at the edges. "Raising your voice will not resolve this," she said quietly. "We need to understand the scope of the review first." Scope. I noticed how her language had shifted, how the certainty that once defined her tone had been replaced with something more cautious, more technical, as if she were trying to manage a situation that no longer responded to control alone. I stood up then, not abruptly, not with intention to interrupt, but simply because it was time to move, time to shift the space again in a way they would feel, but not immediately understand. "Daniel," I said, my voice calm, steady, the same tone I had used when he was young and needed to listen. He turned toward me instantly this time. "Yes." There was no distraction now, no distance, only attention. "When you made those transfers," I continued, choosing each word carefully, "did you verify the authorization process yourself?" He hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. "I trusted that it was handled," he said. "Trusted." I nodded slowly, letting the words settle between us. "And when you used my name," I added, "did you confirm that I had given permission?" The silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was exact. Olivia stepped forward slightly, her posture straightening, her voice regaining a measure of its earlier control. "There is no need to assign blame," she said. "We can resolve this professionally." Professionally. I met her gaze without shifting my expression. "That is exactly what is happening," I replied. Daniel exhaled sharply, running his hand through his hair again. But this time the gesture did not resolve anything. It only revealed more clearly how little control he actually had. "What do you want from us?" he asked finally, his voice lower now, no longer defensive, but searching. I looked at him for a long moment, seeing not just the man standing in front of me, but the distance he had created, the decisions he had made, the assumptions he had built without ever looking back. Then I answered, my voice quiet, but absolute. "I want everything that was taken in my name to be accounted for," I said. Nothing more, nothing less. Neither of them spoke after that. They did not argue. They did not dismiss it. Because for the first time, they understood that this was no longer a conversation they could guide, no longer a situation they could reshape, and most importantly, no longer a home where they could move freely without consequence. The following morning arrived with a quiet that no longer felt peaceful, but precise, as if the house itself had begun to recognize the shift in balance, the subtle but undeniable change in who held control within its walls. I woke at the same hour as always, moved through the same routine, but everything now carried a different weight, not heavier, but clearer, as if each action had purpose again. When I entered the kitchen, Daniel and Olivia were already there, seated across from each other, not speaking, not moving, their attention fixed on the space between them rather than on anything tangible. They both looked up when I walked in, and for the first time since they had arrived, neither of them spoke first. I nodded politely, moving to the counter, preparing my tea with the same steady rhythm I had always maintained. The kettle hummed softly, filling the silence they had left untouched. "We received a notification this morning," Olivia said finally, her voice controlled, but lacking the effortless confidence it once carried. I did not turn. "I expected you would," I replied. Daniel shifted in his seat, leaning forward slightly, his hands clasped together as if holding on to something that was no longer there. They are asking for documentation, he said. Authorization records. Identity verification. Everything. Everything. I poured the hot water slowly, watching the steam rise, taking my time before responding. That is standard procedure, I said calmly. Olivia stood then, not abruptly, but with intention, her posture straight, her movements deliberate, as if she were preparing to regain ground she had already lost. We can resolve this, she said. It is a matter of clarification. These processes can be corrected. Corrected. I turned slightly, meeting her gaze for just a moment. Some things can, I said quietly. Others cannot. Daniel exhaled, the sound heavier now, no longer masked by confidence or distraction. Mom, if this moves forward the way they are indicating, there could be serious consequences, he said, his voice lower, more cautious, as if he were finally beginning to understand the scope of what had been set in motion. I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without softening it. Yes, I replied. There could be. The room fell silent again, but this time it was not uncertain, it was settled, defined by the reality they could no longer adjust or ignore. Olivia's composure held, but just barely, the edges of it now visible in the way she held her hands, in the slight tension in her shoulders. She had built everything on control, on precision, on the assumption that every variable could be managed. Now, for the first time, she was facing something that did not respond to her direction. I picked up my cup and moved to the table, taking my seat with the same quiet precision as always, placing the cup down carefully, aligning it with the edge. You should gather whatever documentation you believe supports your position, I said, my voice even, not instructive, not harsh, simply factual. Daniel looked at me, searching again, but there was nothing left to find, nothing left to negotiate. And you? He asked. I held his gaze for a moment, steady, unyielding, then answered without hesitation. I already have. Neither of them spoke after that, because in that moment, it became clear to both of them that this was no longer about discussion, no longer about persuasion, no longer about shifting the narrative in their favor. It was about evidence. It was about records. It was about truth. And for the first time since they had walked into this house believing they understood everything, they were standing in a situation where none of their assumptions could protect them anymore. The final notice arrived 3 days later, not with urgency, not with noise, but with the quiet authority of something that did not need to explain itself. I was sitting at the same table, my hands folded the same way they had been every morning, when Daniel walked in holding his phone a little too tightly, his expression no longer guarded, no longer calculated, but exposed. They completed the review, he said, his voice low, uneven in a way I had not heard since he was a child trying to admit something he could not fix. I looked up at him calmly, waiting. The transfers are being reversed, he continued, swallowing once before finishing. The accounts are being restored to your control, and they are opening a formal case. The words settled into the room without resistance, without surprise. Olivia stood behind him, still, completely still, her composure no longer something she could rely on, but something she was holding together piece by piece. She did not speak. For the first time, she had nothing to shape, nothing to redirect. I nodded once, slowly, acknowledging what had already been inevitable. I understand, I said. Daniel took a step forward then, closer than he had been in days, but not close enough to erase the distance that now existed between us. Mom, I did not, he started, but the words did not come easily, not anymore. I believed it was handled. I trusted. His voice faded, unfinished, uncertain. I watched him for a moment, seeing the man he had become, the choices he had made, the assumptions he had carried without question. Then I spoke, my voice quiet, but steady. You trusted the wrong person to act in my name, I said. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply stated what was already clear. Olivia finally moved then, stepping forward, her posture still upright, but no longer confident, no longer certain. There was no intention to harm you, she said, her tone controlled, but thinner now, as if the words no longer held the same weight. I met her gaze without hesitation. Intent does not change what was done, I replied. The silence that followed was not empty. It was complete. Daniel lowered his head slightly, his shoulders no longer squared, no longer steady. Olivia did not speak again. She understood. They both did. I stood up slowly, smoothing my hands over my skirt, the same small, precise motion I had made 100 times before, and walked toward the window, looking out at the yard that had remained unchanged through all of this. The same trees, the same light, the same quiet continuity of something that did not shift with their decisions. "You can stay until you make other arrangements," I said finally, my voice calm, measured, not unkind, but not open for discussion. "But this house, my name, my life, will not be handled without me again." Neither of them argued. Neither of them asked for more. Because there was nothing left to negotiate. I remained by the window a moment longer, letting the stillness settle fully, not as something heavy, but as something clear, something restored. Then I turned away, moving back through the house at my own pace, each step steady, each movement intentional, not reclaiming what had been mine, because it had never truly left me, only reminding them, and finally myself, that it had always been.